As we start session 4 in Introduction to Foreign Missions, we find ourselves ready to talk about the sponsoring or sending church. Now, for many, many years, sponsoring church has been the term that's been used amongst our churches. Even farther back, some people would use the word mother church, which is not really a bad term necessarily, because they saw themselves as birthing a new church, and that's really exactly what's happening. And so that term mother church is used. Then sponsoring church is used. I'm not really sure exactly how that terminology came about, but now something that's becoming much more common use for this term is sending church. And actually sending church is a very biblical term. We talked about the fact that the Greek word apostolos or apostolon is where we kind of get our idea for missions from. It means to be sent forth. The Latin word mitto means to send, and so that's really what's going on here. And so I think it's a very, very good term, and it's becoming more and more common to be used amongst our churches to talk about being a sending church. But a lot of churches still do use the phrase sponsoring church, and they're both fine. Neither one of them are anti-biblical or a bad term in and of themselves. But the idea of the necessity of a sponsoring or sending church is unquestionable from the Scriptures. What I'm making very, very clear here, and we talked about this if you had me first year in Intro to Missions, we discussed this to some extent, and the biblical basis of missions in second semester certainly emphasized this, but it cannot be emphasized enough that you cannot go on your own and just say, I think God's called me to Australia and I'm going to go do mission work there. And even go around and ask churches, to help you financially. You cannot do that and be following the path, the example that God established. The idea of a sponsoring church is important, is meaningful, and you need to follow that. And we could take many different scriptures as our guide for this, but the real scripture that is so clear on this that we often use is in Acts chapter 13, and you should be familiar with this. I mean, when someone says, well, why do you have a sponsoring church or a sending church? Why is that so important? Boom, Acts 13. You shouldn't even have to think about it. Here's what it says in Acts 13 in verse 1. Now there were in the church that was at Antioch certain prophets and teachers, as Barnabas and Simeon, that was called Niger, and Lucius of Cyrene, and Manaen, which had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul. And they ministered to the Lord and fasted. As they did that, the Holy Ghost said, Separate me, Barnabas and Saul, for the work whereunto I have called them. And when they had fasted and prayed, they laid their hands on them and sent them away. So here we have just the clear situation. They're all working together there at the church at Antioch, doing ministry there. And from those who are doing ministry, God calls Barnabas and Saul to begin this work of mission endeavor. But He calls also the church there to send them and tells them, this is what I want you to do. Separate them, send them. And so there's no reason for us to even question or even think in our mind that there's a reason not to have a sending church. Certainly the authority that God has given to do His kingdom work here on this earth is found within the church, and so we just operate this way. And we'll talk a little bit more about the details of it, but certainly we understand how important that is. In fact, over in Romans, the 10th chapter, Romans chapter 10, here's what it says in verse 15 of Romans 10. And how shall they preach except they be sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of them that preach the gospel of peace and bring glad tidings of good things. So in our efforts in global evangelism, there is a necessity of sending. Someone must send. It can't be just, that I go and do my own thing. There's this sending element. Now, again, don't forget that that's what the word missionary means. When we look at it in the Latin and the Greek both, that's what that word means. Now, consider the following designations and their distinctions from one another. First, you have the sending or sponsoring church. Those would be synonymous ideas. And this is the church that has authority over the missionary. This is the church that they sit down on the front end and discuss what they want to accomplish. I don't think that a sending church should be so hungry in their authority that they put their thumb on the missionary and he can't breathe. In fact, I think the opposite. I think that the sending church should give the missionary a lot of liberty in the work that he's doing. And the key to them being able to do that with confidence is sitting down on the front end and making sure we're all on the same page. We all agree to what we're trying to accomplish here. We all agree to the methods that we think we're going to use. And if along the way anything changes, we have open lines of communication to discuss that and to work through these things. If we have that kind of relationship, it's no problem at all for the missionary to be able to do his work on the field, to not feel that he's suppressed in what he's doing. But that church does have authority, and the missionary should respect that. Listen, you don't get a church to sponsor you just because, oh yeah, I see that in the Bible, and so in order to make sure I'm doing everything scripturally, kind of get a rubber stamp, kind of thing. It's not about having a relationship with them. It's just about being able to say, so-and-so is my sending church. That's not the way that it needs to be at all. The missionary needs to desire to have a relationship with that church, to have a relationship with that sponsoring pastor, to know that he's cared for, and to trust that this is where God placed the authority. And so I want to be sure that I'm in line with God's authority. We have all throughout the Bible that God worked through authority, and that those who respected authority were greatly blessed of God. In fact, the greatest example that I think of amongst the many in the Bible about the need to respect authority is David, when he respected Saul's authority. And after David had been anointed, and it was clear, at least through what God was saying through Samuel, that he was going to be the next king, he had two opportunities to kill Saul so that he could just, take over, but he refused to do it. And when his men tried to convince him to do it, he said, listen, this is God's anointed, and I will not reach out my hand against God's anointed. If God wants me to be king and him not to be king, God can take care of that. But I'm not going to be the one that makes it happen. I'm not going to manipulate this situation. Even in a situation where the king was evil, where the king was threatening his life, everything screamed, David, you would be justified in doing this. He said no. And it was completely based upon his respect for authority, for even an office that God had put in place. He would not touch God's anointed. Well, I want you to see and understand that the authority of the sponsoring church is very, very important. And so you need, on the front end, to be very careful to make sure that you're entering into a relationship with a sponsoring church that you're going to be comfortable with, that you don't have these fears that they're going to, squelch your ability to do ministry, and that you want to have a relationship with them. You feel comfortable with this relationship. It's not just who can get me the most money, or who can just give me a name so that I can say I have a sponsoring church. No, you really want to have a relationship with them. Well, then the next designation is supporting churches. And the supporting churches are indeed those churches that send you money. Now, those churches do not have any authority over you whatsoever. The only thing those churches can do if they don't like what you're doing is stop supporting, and certainly that's their right. And if they have question about what you're doing, the proper channel is for them to go through your sponsoring church where the authority lies. Not to talk to 15 other pastors about what they think. Not really even to just immediately come to you and outline their grievance, but they should go through your sponsoring church. And then I would think that your sponsoring church, I mean, maybe your pastor will just try to handle it, and maybe he can. But if there's still question or concern that, seems to be merited, now some things are just ridiculous junk that, people are busybodies and they need to get over it, and you'd be better off not to have their support, just don't worry about it. But if it's a legitimate concern, maybe from misunderstanding, or it may be from something that needs to be addressed, I would think your pastor would say, well, let's call brother so-and-so, let's talk to brother so-and-so, and you would be involved in the conversation. But the point is that these churches, although vital to what you're doing, do not have any authority over you. However, you should desire a good, strong relationship with them. You should be hungry to see them really on board with you, and really knowing that, yes, this is a good situation. These churches love me and care about me, and I want to communicate with them and be open with them, but at the same time, I don't answer to them. There's no pressure to answer them whatsoever. I answer to my sponsoring church. And so that's a difference there. Association. We talked about this actually quite a bit in Intro to Missions, that, the association, of course, is where our fellowship of churches come together. It's a voluntary situation. No one has to be involved in that situation. The churches are autonomous, but we do it voluntarily so that we can cooperate in things like missions. Now, you can do that through the association just by using that fellowship as an opportunity to communicate and be, a missionary that's on designated funds, and they send the church of your sponsorship their offerings. And if you were with me last semester or last year, that I think that's the best way to do it. But there is also the National Missionary Program through the ABA, through the Secretary Treasurer of Missions, where you can get on that either as a salaried missionary or a missionary on designated funds. Now, I would encourage you to do that as a missionary on designated funds, because that's still basically all you're saying is that I want to go out and be a missionary, but I love our association, I love our fellowship, I'm a part of it, and so I'm not going to ask for a salary, but I'll be put on designated funds. And what that does for you is it does show that you're a person that supports the overall fellowship and association. And it, they print a poster, and your picture would be on that poster as one of the missionaries, and it kind of gives you also a little bit more exposure without putting you in the situation that I think is not a good situation of being on salary, because you want to go and visit amongst these churches. One of the things we'll talk about before too much longer is deputation, and you want to go and visit and have a real connection with them that is brought about through deputation. But there are those that go on salary. Mostly that is, we don't have a whole lot of foreign missionaries that do that. There's a lot of national missionaries and a lot of interstate missionaries that do that, but not a lot of foreign missionaries. But I just think that it's better to raise your own money, and I certainly would encourage that, but that's there. Mission boards, we talked about that in Intro to Missions. These are people who they're supposed to help missionaries. Missionary agencies, I guess, would be another way to say it. But our concern there is they seem to take away from the authority of the church, and the same would be true with conventions and the most easy example for us, although there are many conventions, is the Southern Baptist Convention. And although I'm thankful for what they believe about salvation and the fact that undoubtedly God has used them to lead many, many people to the Lord, what happens with missions, though, is they just encourage the churches to send all their mission money into the convention, into the missionary organization. And so again, it kind of takes away from that personal effect sometimes with the missionaries. And I just think that all those things, why wouldn't we want all those things to fall into the hands of the local church? I think that's where they belong. So how does a person go about finding a sponsoring church? I mean, if you've been called to do missions, how do you go about finding a sponsoring church? Well, let me give you a little bit of some things to think about. If you are not currently pastoring a church, the church of your membership might be the natural choice. You know, I mean, you're a member there, especially if you've grown up there, especially if you have a long history there, they might be the natural choice. Now, the thing that you've got to be careful about is you don't want to do that just because you've had that long-standing relationship, and even though you love the people there and they're doing a lot of things well, if you've got reason to believe that as a sponsoring church, though, they might leave you hanging, then you don't want to do that. You want to find a sponsoring church that's really going to be there for you and really be excited. But a lot of times, that's kind of the natural choice if you are not currently pastoring that church. But now, the opposite is true if you're the pastor of that church. If you're currently pastoring a church and you're going to go do foreign missions, and it really doesn't even matter how long you've been there at that church, I personally would not recommend asking that church to sponsor you. Now, you may feel very convicted that that's the right thing to do and the way the Lord's leading you, and I would certainly want you to follow the Lord's leadership, but in general, that usually doesn't work out very good. And the reason it usually doesn't work out very good is because if you are leaving on a good note, which hopefully is the case, then the people that are a part of that church, they love you and they think you're the greatest and they hate to see you go. And so they're going to be very impassioned about supporting you, and that might be a good thing. But potentially it could cause division with the new pastor that's coming in. And what kind of man is he? Is he going to be just excited and very much behind what you're doing? Or is he going to be jealous? And if he has jealousy, is it going to be just because of his character? Or is it going to be because ultimately he keeps hearing, well, brother so-and-so this, brother so-and-so that, and because they have such a, that's difficult enough as it is, but because they have still a continued connection with you through you being their missionary, and they're constantly hearing about you and thinking about you, is that going to be even more so of a challenge for him to face? And is it going to be a situation where, because they have that connection with you, they're going to depend on you more? And if something goes wrong, they're going to feel like, well, this is our missionary and our beloved former pastor, let's call him. So all those connections are too, it's just too much. And I really think you'd be far better served to go, to another church. And another thing is that in any church that you have pastored, there's probably at least one person, maybe a few, that have an axe to grind. That really, they never did like you. They never supported anything that you did. And they don't have fond memories of you. They're glad you're gone. And so, as you then, as a missionary, start trying to get things done, and there's certain decisions the sponsoring church has to make, there you've got some people who are already against you, who are already, thinking that they're going to, cause you a problem, just like they caused you a problem while you were there. The only difference is, now you're not there to be the strong voice. A lot of times a pastor can take troubled people, and if you've got the right kind of personality, you can suppress them, and even though they're that type of person, they don't really affect you too bad. But now you won't be there to do that. So I just see a lot of taboos there that I would not encourage that. But when you're looking at choosing a church to be your sponsor, what you're really looking at is, you know that you've been called, and you're looking for the church that God has called in order to send you, just like happened there in Antioch. Now, I want you to be sure that you have agreement with this church. And there are several things that you need to agree upon. Doctrine, of course. How can you go and do this work of planting churches and evangelizing if you don't have doctrinal agreement with the church that's going to sponsor you? You also need to agree somewhat in practice, because I'm not saying you got to be a carbon copy necessarily, but some churches, their practices, the way they carry out their doctrine, is very important to them. Now, some can say, well, this is just a practice, and as long as the practice of our missionary doesn't violate the scriptures, then we're okay with that. But some other churches would be like, no way, we're not going to allow him to do that. He's got to do it exactly like we do it. Well, if that's no problem, if you want to do it exactly like they do it, great. But if you don't, then you got to figure that out. And then methods, that might seem like a same thing as practices, but not really, because methods even, distance themselves from doctrines, in that this is just the way we carry things out, and you need to be able as a missionary, because you're going to be doing things that the sponsoring church doesn't have to do, because it's a church and not a mission, because it's in America and not in a foreign country. You're going to have to do things, and so you can't predict all those things. Some of them will be as you go. You'll learn what you need to do, but you need to be able to say, yeah, we're going to do this, this, and this is how we'll do it, and you need to be able to be open and honest about that, and have agreement on that, and not feel that you're going to get, shortchanged or have handcuffs put on you as time goes on. You need to be able to share your vision, and for the sponsoring church to agree to that, for the sponsoring church to say, wow, that's wonderful, man, we're excited to be a part of this, instead of, okay, yeah, that's fine, and kind of behind the scenes, well, big dreamer, No, you need their support with the vision, and you need a connection with the pastor. Now, I'm not saying that you had to know him for a long time beforehand. It would be probably good if you had that kind of relationship. But what I'm saying is that's going to be your first connection anyway. That's going to be the first person you talk to. And when you sit down and start discussing the possibility of coming together with their church, you need to make sure there's a connection there. You need to make sure that you're on the same page, because he's the one, really, that's going to be your lifeblood through that church. He's the one that can sink your ship or can hoist the sail high. And so you need agreement and connection with that pastor. Make sure it's a church that has the ability to do this. Now, in some sense, all churches have the ability to just say, yes, we'll be your sponsoring church. But I think there's other issues. The sponsoring church needs to support you financially, and if they're not able to support you financially, then, and I think, although this is not a scripture thing, this is just my opinion, I think they need to be your leading supporter. I mean, I think that if someone looked at, here's all the money that came in this month, and kept looking at it, that every month they'd look and say, yeah, the sponsoring church, they're really leading the charge in this, and so if your sponsoring church is going to give you $50 or $100 a month, it's not unscriptural, but at the same time, they're not really taking the lead, and that's what the sponsoring church is supposed to do. And not only do they have the ability financially, but do they have the ability to really want to be a part of this, Now, you and them can decide at what level you think that's important, but I think personally, for the pastor to visit the field from time to time, from groups from the church to come to the field from time to time, for them to really be engaged with you and not be in a situation where when you come back to visit them that they really don't even know what happened. I mean, sure, you send them a report every month, but hardly anybody read it. There was no real attention given to it. You need something better than that. And so just that they have that ability, they want to do that, and they want to really be a part of it. So another big piece of advice for me would be, let God raise up that church. I think sometimes missionaries get too ahead of themselves, and it's more like an advertising campaign to find a church instead of just let God raise up that church. And you can go and spray all over the internet, hey, I am looking for a sponsoring church. You can send out a letter to every single church in the ABA and say, hey, I'm looking for a sponsoring church. And maybe God will raise up the church that way. But I think it probably would be better to pray and let God lead you, to get into situations where you can talk to pastors and let God lead them. And I don't know, sometimes to me it just seems like a desperate situation that people put themselves in, where they're showing up on the scene. I'm missionary to so-and-so place. Now, who wants to be my sponsoring church? In a very public way. And to me, that's just not the right path. In fact, I know that most people wouldn't probably see it this way, but when I see a missionary do that, it causes doubts about them. Because I think, man, they should have been able, with God's help, they should have been able to work that out before they went public, who their sponsoring church is going to be. So let God raise up the church. I would encourage you to have a mission agreement with your sponsoring church. And your mission agreement could be a lot of things, but you need to have within it the things that you think are important to the ministry, the things that you think are important to it personally, and the sponsoring church, needs to have the same thing from their end. And in your student packet, I put in there an example of a mission agreement, and it's just an example. It's not a template necessarily, or even an absolute to follow, but just consider what it says here. Preamble: in obedience to the commission of Christ and His church, believing He is by His Spirit directed this assembly to endorse these missionaries. We mutually agree with the said missionaries to work together according to the following guidelines. Endorsement: XYZ Church in regular conference on such and such date voted unanimously to endorse these missionaries. The XYZ Church agrees to recommend the missionaries to the American Baptist Association for designated funds. The missionaries, the objectives: the missionaries will initially concentrate their focus on language learning on the field. See, that could be very important, because if you believe that learning the language is critical to you ministering to the people, you don't want a sponsoring church pushing you saying, so when are you going to start church? When are you going to start church? When are you going to start church? You want a sponsoring church that says, no, our missionaries there, their very first objective is to learn the language. If they can become fairly proficient in language in their first couple of years there, we'll be happy with that, and anything extra that happens is just a blessing. See, so you may need to line that out. The missionaries will endeavor to establish new and indigenous churches through visitation, personal soul winning, preaching of the gospel. The church grants authority to the missionaries to baptize the candidates who give evidence of repentance and faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. And so, we're going to do evangelism. We're going to do this work of planting churches. And so, yes, you have the authority to baptize those you believe have accepted Christ as their Savior. You don't have to ask us every time that you do that. The missionaries will instruct and train national workers for the responsibility of the works that are established, and will begin a Bible Institute. So if that's part of your vision, you need to have that. The missionaries will, in conjunction with the guidelines for the work in Kenya, or whatever place it might be, as set forth by a a local agency, that you may be able just to go in under the auspices of your local church, but you may have to connect with a missionary agency that has done the proper documentation in that country, and so that might need to be part of your mission agreement. Responsibilities. XYZ Church agrees to assume full responsibility for the missionary's personal conduct, moral integrity, and doctrinal soundness, so they're going to make sure that we continue to be the type of people we're supposed to be. The missionaries agree to be responsible to submit to the authority of XYZ Church, to seek her guidance and counsel in all matters that would reflect upon the church, to uphold her doctrines, principles, practices before sister churches in the world. Might seem simple, but you need to agree to that. If anybody ever gets off of gets out of sorts, then here's what we agreed to. We wrote this. We agreed to it. The missionaries agreed to produce monthly reports to XYZ Church of the labor and monies received. XYZ Church will keep a permanent record of all contributions received for the missionaries and their personal support, and will publish a monthly report to all contributors and others that may desire the report. So, we're going to be transparent. We're going to report. Support. XYZ Church, in addition to endorsing the missionaries, will support them financially and authorize them to seek designated support from other churches through deputation. A special treasurer selected from the mission committee and approved by XYZ Church by the missionaries, as well as the missionaries, will be their treasurer and liaison. Funds received will be held for the missionaries in trust, from which they can draw as needed. Normal expenditures are a salary, housing, health insurance, half of Social Security, travel, work, auto, and actual expenses. So, it's outlined. These are the expenses. So later somebody doesn't come, well, why are we paying that? Well, because that's what we agreed to pay. Extraordinary expenditures, which include any single purchase of over $10,000, shall be approved by XYZ Church. Now, that's quite a bit of liberty in this agreement for the missionary. They may want to have a less number than that, but it depends on the relationship that the missionary has with the sponsoring church. Offerings received during deputation will be kept in trust or in a petty cash fund. The missionaries may claim from these funds actual auto expenses, meals, motels, etc., as allowed by the Internal Revenue, the IRS. So, here's when we're on deputation, here's the things that you're going to pay for, and it's agreed to by the missionaries and by the church. Funds sent or given to the missionaries as personal gifts shall not fall under this rule. So if someone says specifically, I want you to have this personally, they can have it personally. Concerning furlough, the missionaries will serve 3-year terms and then be entitled to 9 months to 1 year of furlough. Terms of the furlough are subject to approval by XYZ Church and may be altered in special situations. The missionaries are entitled to 3 weeks of paid vacation each year. The missionaries are allowed to come home for emergency situations, such as a death in the family, serious illness, or other situations deemed emergency upon the approval by the sponsoring church. And so, again, you just want all this lined out and say, well, that's common sense, Brother Scott. Yeah, but what happens when you get on the field and you say, my mother's on her deathbed, I think I should come home, and I don't have the money to do it personally, I need the church to bring me home, and the church says, no, I don't think that's serious enough. If she passes away, you can come home for her funeral. Oh, Brother Scott, no one would ever do that. Hey, don't fool yourself. Don't fool yourself. Have it outlined. Have in this agreement things that are important to you. Change of sponsorship. In the event that the missionary should ever desire to leave the sponsorship of XYZ Church under the sponsorship of another church, they'll give 90 days notice. All remaining funds that are in trust, the assets, will be forfeited to the new sponsoring church. However, if the missionary should abandon the doctrinal teachings in which the sponsoring church believes and associate themselves with some other religion, all funds remain in trust, will be held in the mission fund of the sponsoring church to be used as it sees fit. So if this is just a mutual agreement and we believe it is a good thing for us to seek out another church, or if we're seeking out this other church and it's because it's not anything on our fault, we haven't went doctrinally wrong, or we're not just rebelling against the authority of the sponsoring church, then the money's going to be turned over. But if it's fault on our end, then they're not going to turn the money over, because they're not going to let the money that these supporting churches gave go towards something they can't agree with. Termination. Should Pauline decide to terminate the missionaries, they'll give them 90 days notice and will provide return transportation for them and their family and 1 month's salary as severance pay. Should any funds remain, Pauline will distribute them as sees fit. So if you get over there and they decide to fire you, then here's what we agreed to that we would do. Now again, you may think it's crazy, but people are crazy sometimes. And to think that you'd get over there and they'd say, well, you're fired, hope you can get home, I'm telling you, it could happen. But when you've got something in writing that you've all agreed to, they're not going to do that, because they realize we agreed to this. In case of expatriation, the sponsoring church will furnish return transportation and will continue salary for 90 days. So that is that the host country may say you can't be here anymore. In that case, they'll get you home and pay you for 3 months. In case that the missionaries become disabled or have a death, the sponsoring church will provide return transportation, will continue the salary to the family for 90 days. In case of the death of any member of the missionary's immediate family on the field, the sponsoring church will provide transportation for the body to the United States if the family so desires. So again, that may not cover everything, but it's pretty thorough. And in your particular specific cases, there might be some things that would be important to you that might not be important in general to other missionaries. And so, you have to figure out how this all works. But you should have an agreement. You should not just shake hands and say, that's good enough for me. I think that you're in danger if you do that. It's not a lack of faith to have something in writing. All it is it's an establishing, here's what we agreed upon. Listen, if you have a meeting now and decide, okay, here's what we're all going to do, and you're a long-term missionary 10 years from now, and it's a new pastor at the church that sponsors you, is everybody going to remember what you said you would do? Is everybody, this is not a lack of faith. This is not even a lack of trust. This is just us all saying, let's agree to what we're going to do, and let's put it in writing so we don't forget what we said we would do. And so I really, really encourage you to do that. Have a mission agreement. I think that having a missionary committee is a good thing for a church. And I think the reason that's a good thing is because they can have, that means somebody's given special attention to missions. If somebody doesn't give special attention to missions, it'll just get shoved on the back burner. Then especially if they're sponsoring a missionary, then they have the ability to, monthly or at least quarterly, however often they would meet, and then if they need to meet more often, to be committed to do that, to say, okay, how's our missionary doing? What are they experiencing? What's going on right now? And you have all those things being paid attention to. And you also have a group of people that have been selected that the missionary knows, okay, this is who I go through. And that's why I think that for the missionary's treasurer, which is the next thing, you need to have a treasurer that's dedicated to that. You noticed in the agreement it said that. A treasurer that's dedicated to, the money doesn't just go in the church's general fund or the church's regular treasurer doesn't take care of this, there's a treasurer who specifically takes care of this. And that's very, very important to have somebody dedicated to that. And so the treasurer, and if the committee has a chairman of the committee, then that might be the liaison, or the treasurer might be the liaison. But the point is, somebody on that committee, the missionary is going to be communicating with them regularly, and then they can communicate to the committee. It just gives a structure for some things to be handled, and awareness to be kept up. And it's important for awareness to be kept up. Now, so that's what you want to do. You want to get a sponsoring church that you're definitely on the same track with, that you definitely have agreement with, that you definitely have a relationship with. They sense and feel they're in this together with you, and they really want to be that. They don't want to be, just a distant, we put our label of approval on you kind of thing. They really want to be a part of this ministry. The next thing that we need to think about is the importance of surveying the field. We need to do a field survey. And I think that what we often call a survey trip, before you go public and say, yes, I'm going to do this, before you and your sponsoring church, lay down all this stuff, to have never been to the field, it's not a good idea. Now, that doesn't mean that a person couldn't do that. I'm not saying that a person couldn't do that, and we look back and we see biblical examples where people did do that. But listen, we live in a very different age, and it's easy to go to the field and do some survey work, and it's going to help you tremendously to do that. Who should go on a survey trip? Your wife should definitely go on the survey trip. You don't want to go over there and you do all the planning, thinking, checking stuff out, and not take her with you. There are so many things that you won't see that can only be seen through her eyes, but need to be seen, about what your family's going to face and what kind of things you need to plan and prepare for. Your wife should go with you on the survey trip, because the survey trip probably has two elements to it. One is confirming this calling to this specific place, and she needs to be a part of that. And two is being prepared. What kind of things do I need to gather? What kind of things do I need to get together? What do I need to be prepared for when I get here? Those two elements are so important, and so she needs to be a part of that. I think for the sponsoring pastor to go would be wonderful. I don't think he has to go, but I think it would be good for the sponsoring pastor to go on this survey trip. That way he's got an upfront knowledge of what you are going to face as a missionary and what you're going to go through. Maybe, if it's feasible, maybe another church representative, maybe the chairman of the mission committee, or your mission treasurer. Perhaps, again, these aren't have-to situations, but if they could go and wanted to go, might not be a bad thing. Someone with experience on that field or a similar field needs to go with you. You may be going to a country where there's already some missionaries there. They might not be working in the area you plan on going to, but they're within country. Well, you want to solicit their help. Tell them, I'm coming for a survey trip. I'm thinking about doing work in this area of the country. Could you go down there with me with your experience and things you've already learned? You probably would help us have a more effective trip, and you'd give us another set of eyes to see things through that, would maybe temper some of the things that we might get, too far one way or the other on, and that would be so super helpful to you. Or there might not be anyone in that country, but in that region, or someone that's in a familiar setting, or even there are within our work, and it's probably true in all works, some people that are just familiar with the world in general. They've traveled a lot, they've been in a ton of different countries, and if it just doesn't seem like there's a natural choice, like, oh, there's a missionary already there, or just in this neighboring country, this missionary could come help us. If there doesn't seem to be a natural choice, maybe even one of those persons that's traveled a lot and done a lot of mission work in different countries could go with you. And again, because of their experience, they would have vision to see things that you would miss and that you wouldn't see. And they'd have the ability to say, now, be sure to pay attention to this. Did you notice that? And they would be very, very helpful to you. A survey trip is basically counting the cost. That's basically what it is. We look over at Luke chapter 14 and see that the Lord encouraged us to count the cost and to be prepared, to make ready, because if we don't do that, then we're going to bring shame to ourselves and then ultimately to His kingdom. And it says in Luke 14 verse number 28, Luke 14 verse number 28, "For which of you, intending to build a tower, sitteth not down first to count the cost, whether he has sufficient to finish it? Lest haply after he has laid the foundation and is not able to finish it, all that behold it begin to mock him, saying, This man began to build and was not able to finish. Or what king going to make war against another king sits not down first and consulteth whether he's able with 10,000 to meet him that comes against him with 20,000? Or else, while the other is yet a great way off, he sends an ambassage and desires conditions of peace." So basically, when people are doing something major, they count the cost to make sure they can do it, to make sure that things are going to work out, to make sure they're prepared, that they don't get stopped in the middle and come to shame, that they don't not have enough money to do it, that they don't have enough strength to do what's going to have to be done. So we count the cost when we go on a survey trip. Now, why are some people against the idea of taking a survey trip? Well, because of money. I mean, they might give a lot of other reasons, but I find a lot of times that even though people give these other reasons, the reality is that it's a financial situation. Listen, it costs some money to take a survey trip. It costs, a certain number of plane tickets, and it costs expenses there on the field. It costs some money to take a survey trip. So just be aware that some would be against it because of that. Some would be against it because they say it's a lack of faith. If God called you to go, just go. Why in the world do you need to go over there and check it out? That's like the spies when they went into Canaan land and they came back with a bad report. That kind of thing. Well, that's true about the spies going into Canaan land. They just rejected God's will. But there were other times that there were spies sent, and that's not what happened. They just spied out the land, figured out a strategy, came back and reported information. So, you got to be careful about how you throw out biblical examples that prove your point when there's other biblical examples that prove the opposite point. And so here we see that it's not a lack of faith. It's counting the cost. It is spying out the land. Not to say, oh, I'm not going to do what God wanted me to do, but to say, here's what I've got to do to be prepared, and here's what I've got to do to be ready. And that's perfectly fine. And should you get there and something happen to help you figure out that it's not God's will, listen, that's far better to spend $5,000 to $10,000 to figure out it's not God's will than to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to figure that out 2 years later. It's way better to take that survey trip and to figure that out. So, why is a survey trip then necessary? If it's not, just that we're wasting money, if it's not a lack of faith, why is it necessary? Well, as I've already mentioned, to make sure this is God's will for your life, to make sure that your wife can face the reality of this decision. Listen, when you're looking at pictures in a book, and when you're talking to missionaries that have been on the field and hearing their exciting stories of people being converted and dozens of churches being started, when you're looking at all this through the perspective of a dream, it's easy to be enamored and to not realize what you're really going to have to face, even for people to say to you, well, now listen, There's tough times and there's difficult circumstances, and you're going to make this sacrifice and that sacrifice. Oh, yes, but we're willing to make that sacrifice. Well, listen, when you're standing there seeing it and smelling it, it's different. And you need that. You need to face it head on to say, okay, to count the cost. Am I really committed to doing this? Am I really willing to step out here and say, I'm going to do this? Yes, Lord, we see it, but we know this is what you want us to do. And your wife needs to be able to do that along with you. Figure out what it will take to live there and minister there. That's part of going on a survey trip. What am I going to have to be able to live here and to minister here? There may be things you've got to bring with you. And you don't want to get over there and then figure that out. You want to figure that out on the front end. There may be things that you got to get some money together for that you didn't realize on the front end. And so you've got to be figuring out what is it going to take. And another reason is to determine what kind of things I need to plan and prepare before I come. It might not be just a physical item that you need to bring with you, but there might be certain systems and ideas that you'll get there and you'll sit and say, before we get over here, we need to think through this and plan this and get it all together so that we're prepared when we get here, rather than adjusting after we get here. There might be some things like that. So a lot of things are not going to be like that. In fact, you could plan and prepare and get it all together, and then you'd get there and be like, oh, gee, I didn't think about that. I didn't realize this about the culture. This is not going to work. And you'd have to scrap it and start all over anyway. So a lot of things you really can't before you get there, but some you might. And so you need to realize that. You need to be looking at that. How can you then make the most of your survey trip? Well, be a learner. To be a know-it-all is very prideful. And I assure you, no matter how much studying you've done, no matter how much talking to other missionaries you've done, there's a whole lot you don't know about this field that you're going to. And if you go there thinking, oh yeah, I already knew that. I already talked to so-and-so about that. Yeah, I realized that. And you go with that attitude, you're going to miss a ton of stuff. And when you get there, you're going to get knocked on your butt by the culture and then you will realize you didn't know what you thought you knew. Just be open. Be a learner. Be the person that doesn't know anything and is trying to figure out everything. And you'll take in a lot more that way. You need to write things down so that you can sift through the information. Just have something to write with available at all times. Write it down. And then later you can sift through it and you might decide, okay, that's not really important, but I want to transfer this over here and be sure to keep track of that. And I'm talking about all kinds of stuff, prices of things, availability of things, little cultural nuances that you notice. Write things down. Keep a written record so you can go back through and you can sift through it. It might even help you while you're on your survey trip, much less when you get back and you're doing more planning and preparing. Don't have the idea of going native. Speak to other expatriates. You don't need to trick yourself into thinking you're going to go there and live like those people, because you're not. Unless it's a developed country. You're not. In a third world situation, you're not going to live like those people, so you need to get that out of your head. It's not going to help you in ministry, and it's certainly not going to help your family. So that's not what you're looking for. Go and find the other foreigners. The native people expect you to come there and live like a foreigner. You are a foreigner. They expect you to come there and live like a foreigner. So go see what the other foreigners are doing. I'm not saying that you go and try to get a situation where you live in the lap of luxury, that you live exactly like you do here in the United States. But you need to go and figure out what others are doing and what it's going to take for you to live in that kind of situation. You're not going there thinking, okay, I'm going to get a little plot of ground and build my grass hut. That's not the way to think about it. And think through the possible biases of people that you talk to. See, one of the things you're going to want to do is you're going to interview people and talk to them. I mean, you need to think through the possible biases. Like you might interview a native and say, hey, I think I'm going to come here and start a church, and I'm just wondering how receptive do you think people will be? And he might be, oh, they'll be so receptive. In fact, I've been praying that such an opportunity would happen, and how I would love to help you when you get here, blah, 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 blah. Okay, great, wonderful. It's exciting to hear that kind of thing. But is that guy really that? Or does he see you as gravy train? And man, if I can hitch my wagon to this guy, he'll be able to help me financially. Look at the biases. The missionary that's there helping you look at things. I know he will be helpful to you, but at the same time, he might have some biases that, you need to be careful about. The people that come with you, your sponsoring pastor, if he comes with you, he'll certainly have some biases. And so you just need to think through all that. So-and-so said this, and so-and-so said this, and so-and-so said this, but, they are looking at it through these eyes. And so I've got to keep that in mind. So next time, we'll come back and talk more about how we can be productive on our survey trips. We'll talk about doing some pre-survey research. We'll talk about the things that we're going to try to learn while we're on our survey trip.